personally, I love therapy. I think it's great because it creates that space for you in your week, your month, that's for you, that you don't get otherwise, because no matter how much our family, our friends, our partners, whatever, support us, and they might give themselves to you, they're not impartial. They're going to bring a level of emotion or thought or opinion to it that a therapist doesn't, because they have that distance and they have that clarity that maybe family don't have, because they love you and they're concerned and all of that. A therapist can separate that.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Changes Big and Small. This is your host, Damian. Changes Big and Small will help you take action in your life with intention and purpose. In each episode, I invite you to accept unexpected challenges that will help you make progress to build the life that you want. In this episode, I'm speaking with psychotherapist Sarah Eames. Sarah has experience with a range of mental health problems, and she's been working for many years with CBT and compassion-focused therapy. She founded Speakeasy Virtual Therapy in September 2020 as a way for people to continue accessing therapy during the pandemic. Her Instagram handle is Speakeasy Virtual Therapy. You can definitely find that link in the show notes. And welcome to Changes Big and Small, Sarah.
Thank you very much for having me. You're very good for having me on.
You started your practice independently, I guess,
yes.
Right in the middle of COVID. Tell us about that change.
Yeah, so it's funny because I moved back to Ireland the December before the pandemic really took hold. I was living in Cambridge in the UK, working over there with the NHS. I'd been working in that job intensely for 3 years, decided to come home and take a month or two for myself. And then COVID happened and I ended up staying put in Ireland. And I got a job in a mental health service in Dublin. That was going really well. And I just kept hearing people talking about their struggles through the pandemic. And then when we couldn't actually attend sessions and things like that, I've been on Instagram myself privately for years. And I just thought if there was a resource for people, they could dip in and out, be it that they need an inspirational quote or they want to have some strategies or skills, that everyone needed something through the pandemic. Something I would have always done historically is if I saw an Instagram page that I thought was useful for mental health resources, I would say to clients, go on to Instagram and see this person. They do really good stuff. What I'd started to do was compile all of that onto an Instagram page that I had, which then one day I just kind of had a light bulb moment of like, well, why don't I do this properly and give it a name? So I changed the Instagram name to Speakeasy Virtual Therapy. I went on and I said, I'm a psychotherapist. If anyone needs any support through the pandemic and just wants to have a chat with me. Straight away, I started getting a response naturally because people were struggling. I was surprised though how open people were to the virtual side of it. So then I just took it a step further and went down the private route as well. So I still work in the mental health service in Dublin, but I also then took on Speakeasy and it's gone very well, which is good. And then also I'm aware that it's good because people are struggling. So it's kind of a double-edged sword.
Definitely. So many people are struggling right now.
Yeah.
I mean, it seems sometimes as if COVID times are endless.
Yeah.
Some people are beginning to see kind of a glimmer out of it.
Yeah. Here in Ireland, we just got news today that we are coming out of lockdown officially. I think it's on the 10th of May, after being in it since pretty much the day after Christmas. So it's been a very long lockdown for us. Definitely people have really struggled. This lockdown, even more so than the first one, I think there was an element of like, oh, this is different. With the first lockdown, people didn't really know what to expect from it. And although there was a lot of suffering and anxiety, they were more accepting of it. Whereas I think when this lockdown happened and then we heard it was going to go on till May, that really has had such a knock-on effect for people's mental health because of family life, work life, all that stuff. It's really damaged people, more so this time around.
You mentioned that with starting Speakeasy, you were kind of surprised how open people were and the fact that virtual didn't seem to be so much of a barrier. What else has surprised you in this journey?
I think that really was the first thing that really surprised me is people's willingness to move virtually. I had my own misconceptions about virtual therapy before. I know that sounds strange, seeing as I have a virtual therapy service now. When I was working in Cambridge, if you had said to me, you know, you're going to be doing all your sessions online for a year, I would have said, that's not going to work. That's not effective. A bit like telephone therapy, which I had worked in before. I found it a little bit of a barrier, but you couldn't see the people. And I think I hadn't really accounted for that with the virtual side. So that was a surprise that people have been so willing, and how after the first minute or two, even, you know, now chatting to you, for the first minute, I'm very aware of myself. I can see myself, but then you kind of forget about that as well. So very quickly you kind of switch back into, oh, this is now a session, or this is the environment I'm in. I've been surprised at the impact of it. I'm still getting results with clients. We're still getting people where they need to be in terms of therapy, regardless of the fact that it's not face-to-face. I think that has been the biggest surprise. And then I suppose the other thing is that, surprisingly and not surprisingly, people are coming for therapy during the pandemic. They are taking the time out for themselves, and it's a good surprise. It is a downtime for a lot of people. They're not in work, maybe their routine has changed so dramatically, but people are prioritizing self-care a lot more, which is a good surprise. I would have not necessarily thought that we'd be as good at that as humans as we have been, because we're all so good with being fast.
I guess in some sense, there really is no choice if people need help. And so people who may have been cautious or pessimistic before are willing to try something different because that's the option available.
That's it. They're more willing to try, but I think people are acknowledging that they're struggling a lot more as well. Mm-hmm. Whereas before, because we were busy in that rat race of speed. I was saying to a client only today, we're so used to go. Now it's slow. It's a shift in speed for us as well. But I think that people are normalizing a little bit. Hopefully, I'm hearing it anyway, that it's okay to actually say, I'm really struggling today. I just hope that when things return to whatever version of normal they look like for us going forward, that we retain that. I hope that we just continue in that way, really, to, you know, not mask how we're feeling so much, and that if you need support from a mental health service or from anyone, that you still access that, be it virtual or face-to-face, whatever way you're comfortable with.
Are you finding that people are taking the time to notice and address issues that have been around for some time? Yeah. Or are there new issues that are surfacing because of COVID? What's the balance of those?
That's such a good question, because I think it's such a mix, really. I think what it's done is it's highlighted for people who had, you know, historic pre-existing stresses, worries, distress, that maybe now I needed to look at this. Or it's been compounded by the pandemic. So they were already struggling. Then other factors have come into play that they never really saw coming, and they've kind of hit the wall. But for a lot of people as well, they've decided to get in ahead of things. Like I've heard some people who've come to therapy with me, for example, are saying, I'm starting to notice I'm getting stressed, Sarah, and I want to get in ahead of this now, because I know that in a few weeks or in a few months, the world's going to open up and I'm going to be back at work, or the kids are going to be doing this or whatever. So some people are forward planning, which is really, really good. But for some people, though, who would have possibly not identified with the fact that they had anxiety before, coming out of the pandemic seems to be creating a lot of anxiety. They've been okay at home. It's actually been all right. But the idea now of going back on a train and commuting to work, how is that going to work? Or if I do get on an airplane, or if I do go to that concert, or whatever it is, there's a lot of social anxiety coming up for people. I'm hearing that a lot in sessions, and just a return to normal, whatever that is, there's that anxiety.
A lot of people are familiar with talk therapy. Mm-hmm. I think that's probably the kind of therapy that first comes to mind.
Yes.
Maybe some people are also familiar with cognitive behavior therapy, for example. Yeah. But there are so many different types of therapy. Just before we started talking, I was listening to a podcast and they were talking about IFS, Internal Family Systems, which is by Richard Schwartz. You have expertise in some different modalities as well. Can you tell us about the different approaches that you use in your practice that people might want to look into if they're interested in therapy?
Absolutely. So I nearly would say that I'm a little bit integrative, even though I have different modalities. I'm a CBT therapist, which is a cognitive behavioral therapist, which is essentially looking at what you think about and what you do and how that impacts you in your day-to-day life. Are the things that you do helpful or unhelpful? If I have a thought about something, what does that lead me to do? And we would often look at, the cycles that we move in as a result of that. Are we in a vicious cycle? Is it a helpful place for us to be? Could we be doing things in a different way? So kind of challenging those thoughts and those behaviors. And then I work with compassion focused therapy, which is CFT. So it's a lot of letters. I was only explaining this to someone today, which is that it's almost the opposite of CBT, in that CBT is very practical and about challenging your assumptions, your beliefs, trying to give you alternative evidence. Compassion focused therapy is all about the feeling. We want to talk about your compassionate side. You're kind to someone else, like you would treat someone else with respect. So sharing that with yourself. I kind of almost blend the two of those together in a way in sessions, depending on what the client's needs are. I also work with EMDR, which is eye movement desensitization and reprogramming, which is to do with PTSD, really. A lot of the time it's to do with trauma. We recognize that the body holds score, and that in order for us to move past a trauma, we need to really engage with our body. So through that, we actually get you to either use tapping or eye movement. So that's slightly different. Through the pandemic, I haven't really been using that very much, though, because it's virtual, and I find that is a little bit of a barrier for that type of therapy. So I've very much been using cognitive behavioral therapy, and compassion focused therapy has come in a surprising amount as well.
A few years back, I had a therapist and we did cognitive behavior therapy. What I remember from that, what stays with me still and what I try to practice is some of the mental habits around catastrophizing. And so say that something, it's the end of the world when really it isn't, and how our words impact our emotions and our behaviors and those cycles. Even now, when I hear the word should, and I think it's from that therapy.
Yes, it's the rules, the shoulds and the musts.
Yeah, I have a tendency to say, oh, is it really a should here? And that's something that has kind of stayed with me. So yeah.
That's great, because if there's an element of doubt, if there's doubt, then we can't treat it as fact. We always talk about facts and opinions in cognitive behavioral therapy. Is it a fact, or can we challenge that? The one that's coming up a lot for people at the moment is compare and despair as well, which is where if you compare yourself to something or someone in any way, you're automatically despairing. I'm hearing people saying, well, this person's managing really well through the pandemic. I should be able to do that. As soon as you put that compare in there, what do you think you're doing? So that comes up quite a lot at the moment for people. But those unhelpful thinking patterns, I think, are very much at the foundation of all the CBT stuff. Did you find it useful overall, the type of therapy?
I did. Yeah. I haven't ever tried talk therapy. That's not true. I did try talk therapy once, and it was a very interesting experience because I got the sense that the therapist was telling me, oh, don't you have friends to talk to about some of these things?
Okay.
It was really odd because I was like, well, I'm coming to you because I want to talk things out. I want to process them without input from my friends necessarily. So that was interesting. I was just telling my sister about EMDR a couple of nights ago, and she was like, eye movement. So I move my eyes to help myself feel better. I think a lot of people are really confused by EMDR. Can you give us a synopsis about EMDR?
Yeah, I mean, it's a bit of a minefield to me too, to be honest, because of the fact that it works. And sometimes we don't really understand ourselves why it's working. I remember when I first started, when I got qualified, I'm only qualified in it 2 years now. So I trained over in Cambridge. And I was working with it for a year, and then the pandemic happened. I'm not going to pretend to know every little piece about it, because through the pandemic, I haven't had the opportunity to use it in the same way. What I can tell you about it is that, as I was saying there, that the body holds the score is a major aspect of it. And what happens is, with the eye movement, you're replicating the deep sleep patterns that happen. So when you're in a deep sleep, in that REM sleep, your eyes will do the same movement. And it's actually helping process information from the day when you're sleeping. It works in the same way for trauma. So it's why when someone goes through a trauma, they say, like, rationally or up here, I completely understand that I am past this. That has happened, whatever that situation was is in the past. Why am I still feeling this way? And it's because your body hasn't had time to catch up. So what it does is it connects both mind and body. and it gives the person the full impact. I mean, it's a very powerful therapy for anyone who's ever had it or has delivered it. It's unlike any other therapy I've ever been a part of. It's just powerful is the word that comes to mind for me, because people have physical reactions in these sessions. It's not just crying. People feel sick, they get sick. People have rashes because it's wherever your body is holding it. I had one client once who had, a situation that had happened where there was physical contact in terms of the trauma, and they actually started coming up in a rash on the places where the impact had happened because their body was still going through it. And when you go home and you go to sleep, over the course of the sessions, you start to have some strange nightmares sometimes because the trauma is working its way through. So sometimes with the EMDR, you feel worse before you feel better. Now that's true of all therapy, in fairness, but sometimes you have to feel a little bit worse before you feel better. But it's very, very much true with the EMDR. But it's very much safe, it's contained, and we move it at a pace that works for the client. But it does work. I've never had a situation where it hasn't worked, because it's your own experience, it's your own body recalling it, and it has passed. Your body just hasn't had time to catch up. So it's all kind of based around the here and now. That was then and this is now. Let's update that memory. Let's update where you are. So if it is that you've been in a situation where, like someone has robbed you and now you see them out, even if you see them out, like living their lives, in this moment, they're not robbing you. And that's what we need to communicate to not only our brain, but to our body. And that's what the processing does. It's very powerful though. Like it still is, as much as we understand it, even as therapists, something you say in the sessions is go with that, go with that. And I sometimes find myself going, okay, go with that. Just go with it because it's working.
Yeah, that's interesting. And you describe it as being for trauma. So then that immediately makes me think, okay, has everybody gone through some sort of trauma? And you also mentioned the book, The Body Keeps the Score,
Yes.
a couple of times. I mean, you mentioned the phrase, but is that a book that you recommend as well?
Yes, it's excellent. Yes, it's a really good book. And it's funny, I did a Reiki course last year just for something to do. I was kind of curious about it. And they recommended the book. It's a completely different thing. And they were like, this book is amazing. It's a really good book. But in terms of, does it have to be trauma? They say no, but I've never worked with anyone who hasn't experienced a single trauma. It's very effective for individual trauma. So what I mean by that is if you have been in a once-off car accident or something that's happened in a single event, it works really well and quite quickly. For people who have maybe more complex trauma or a series of traumas, it's not that it doesn't work, it still works, but it's going to be a little bit more complex, obviously, in terms of trying to tease that out in terms of your body as to what's what. But in terms of when I was training, they would have said it works really well for low self-esteem, for depression, for anxiety. But because trauma is such a physical impact, there's so much that your body has to hold on to and process that we just shut down and just on to the next thing. It's partially to do with that, why it's so effective then.
Yeah, as you were talking, it's making me think. I lived in India for a couple of years, and one evening I was going to visit a friend, and this guy came up to me and started propositioning me just out of the blue. Eventually I said, okay, if you won't stop, I'm going to scream and everybody will come out. And then he started walking away from me, but then he walked back towards me, grabbed me, and then ran back away and got on his bike and cycled away. And so I think that many people have, and I mean, I wasn't hurt. I continued on to my friend. We were going out that evening, like everything continued. I think I was a bit shocked and a little bit heightened emotion for some time. But then I also noticed that for the next few days, the thing that stayed with me was, oh, I don't know what this guy looks like. It could be any of numerous guys on the bike that I see every day, and I wouldn't even know which one it is.
Yeah, it's interesting.
I haven't really thought about that when I see people on bikes recently, but then that makes me think.
As we're talking now, it's all straight away bringing you back there. That's the power of our memory and our body, is that your body has held on to that in some way. And it doesn't hang on to every piece of the story. It'll hang on to the bit that is, we call it the distress spot, the hot spot. When you go through therapy, especially with trauma, there's that that piece around when you break down that scene, what is the hot spot? What is the distressing part? And it's an image for people. It could be literally when he went to grab you. It could be him getting on the bike. You might have 3 or 4 of those. And in EMDR, that's where you do the processing on those hot spots. Similarly to CBT, they're the parts that we actually start to challenge and create the evidence. So there's definitely layovers between CBT and EMDR as well that I like, because we're bringing you back. In CBT, we often talk about the here and now as well. Like this, that was then, this is now. So there are definitely overlaps. I find sometimes in EMDR, I have used CBT strategies and vice versa. I've turned to EMDR and CBT before as well. So that's why I kind of say I'm not an integrative therapist, but in ways I kind of merge everything that I've been lucky enough to learn over the years.
The other thing that I then wonder is, how do you decide what kind of therapy to pursue? How do I choose out of all of the options and modalities and integrative therapy? Yeah. Where would someone start?
I think that's a really good point, isn't it? That there's so many different types of therapy. Sometimes people feel flooded in a way with all the different information out there. Something that we do at Speakeasy is we offer a consultation, first of all, for that very reason, that when someone comes, they're coming because they're struggling with something in some capacity. So for some, it's anxiety, for some, it's depression, whatever is going on for that person. I think the first thing that we would always say is that you need to look at what it is you're hoping to get from the therapy. So not the type of therapy, but what is your own personal goal? Is it more than I want to feel better, because that's a given, but more than that, is it that you want to challenge your critical thinking? Is it that you've been through a traumatic experience? Have you lost someone? Are you grieving? Trying to help you to establish that. And sometimes that's the therapy in itself. I think if you're someone who likes to talk and wants to process, talking therapy is a great way to go. It should give you the space, depending on who your therapist is, to facilitate that, just to give you that space to process. Counselling is very good for that. CBT is very collaborative and is very much about putting you in the driving seat and making you your own therapist, essentially, at some point. You learn coping strategies. Way to not counselling. I love counselling. I've had counselling. It's very effective. But what I find with counselling is that you're processing, you're talking, and then that's it. That's really helpful, say, in a situation where you have lost someone, or you've gone through a breakup and you just want to figure out your own parts. I find for people who've separated and things like that, it's really good because it gives them that time just to say, do you know what, I'm in a pickle here. I just need to feel what I'm feeling. That's not so great in CBT, actually. Where CBT is very effective is if you are trying to put, I suppose, strategies in place. You want to create a bit of an action plan. You maybe are trying to make a decision on something, or you recognize that you're in a very unhealthy or negative thinking pattern or behavior. That's where CBT is very effective. So for things like depression, anxiety, panic, trauma, it's very good. The compassion-focused therapy is very much about if you recognize that you are very hard on yourself, you have a lot of self-doubt, maybe there's that imposter syndrome coming into play there. Compassion-focused therapy works really well with that. If you've gone through a single trauma and you are finding it difficult to talk about the experience, but are having a lot of flashbacks, or it's disrupting your sleep, which is often symptoms for people with trauma, EMDR would be a good route to go. But there is so much out there. I think if you're uncertain, rather than Googling, because you can end up down the rabbit hole with that, I think the first thing to do is talk to your GP, or if you know of a service. Sometimes it's through word of mouth. You know, sometimes you hear a friend say, look, I went to this therapist. But in the times that we're in, everything is virtual and everyone is online. It's the right time to be doing your little bit of research at the same time. So you can find us on Instagram, which again, a year ago you wouldn't have done. So people are more accessible now.
For some of my previous therapy sessions, like you said, you could have an initial call with the therapist. And in fact, one of them actually gave like a whole session. So I could see what the work between us would be like.
That's it. And I think it's such a key part of therapy is your therapist, the therapeutic relationship. Even myself, I've had 3 therapists over the years. I didn't actually have a bad experience with any of them, but at different points where they would have met me, I might have had different needs. So it's finding what your client needs, but also just maybe it's not the right fit therapy-wise or therapist-wise, not to bash any therapists, but sometimes it's just not a good fit. It's a little bit like, I say wearing a pair of shoes. It has to be a good fit because you're going to talk to this person about the deepest, darkest parts of your experience, your saddest moments, your most stressful moments. You don't want to feel judged. You don't want to feel that they're rushing you through something or that they're ill-equipped to do that. You know very quickly, I think, with a therapist. And that's why we offer the consultation as well in our service, because we want you to make sure that I'm a good fit for you, or that the type of therapy that you're being offered is going to be right for you. And we don't want you to have to pay for that. So it's between 30, 45 minutes consultation. It's either with myself or my colleague. And we essentially just want to get a sense of where you're at. So we just ask, what is the problem you're experiencing at the moment? Is there anything you're doing already that's helpful or not so helpful? The feedback we get all the time is that they find that consultation really helpful, because if they weren't thinking in the way of goal setting, now they are, or it just helps them to connect some dots. A few clients have said, like, I didn't actually really realize that was connected to this, only when I was talking in the consultation. At that stage, then we would make our recommendation as to whether, CBT is a good fit. Some people have had it before. Some people have no idea what CBT is when they come to us. So it's just about, I suppose, finding what the client needs and making sure that that's what you're delivering.
I've had a variety of therapists depending on what the issue is. Sometimes I look for a therapist that specializes in that issue.
Yeah.
And I've had very mixed results in terms of the relationship that I've been able to build with the therapist. And I think for me, part of it is trusting myself to know what is the right time to persist with the relationship, or to decide, okay, this is not working and I'm prioritizing my health, my self-care, the reason I'm here. So for example, my very first therapist, we had a very good relationship until I was trying to make a decision about something. And she gave me advice that was very contradictory to my values and values that I had shared with her. And so I felt a bit betrayed in that moment. And then that really hurt the relationship between us. So is it ever possible for somebody to actually be hurt from a therapy session? Are there warning signs people need to look for?
Yes, I think, there are some red flags with a therapist or a therapeutic relationship. It might start out okay. And as you say that, you get to a point in therapy where you feel that the therapist should have a sense of who you are, your values, your beliefs. And if they're persistent and they're pushing you in a direction that you have a reaction to that, it's about exploring that. I think you have to feel comfortable to talk to your therapist about that. Communication is very important. But if you're at a point where you don't even feel you can communicate that to your therapist, there's possibly a reason for that. It's the therapist's job to make you feel safe. But if you're not someone who's used to being assertive, or you're afraid of confrontation, let's say, how do you go about that then when you feel hurt by your therapist or let down by your therapist in some way? I think recognizing the difference between that and when actually the therapist might know to push you that little bit, because maybe they can see that you're just about to get to where you need to be. But you'll only be able to figure that out by having that communication with the therapist. I think the red flag that I would say to look out for is when you get to that point, if it does happen that you're finding your values are leading you one direction, the therapist is trying to advise you to go another way with things. If your instinct and your gut instinct is not that you don't want to talk about it because there's anxiety there, but actually you feel like, I can't talk to my therapist about this, they're not listening to me, or they're not going to take this on board, that is a problem. You need to have, it's trust, it's that understanding and respect. It comes back to trust. You have to trust that your therapist knows what they're doing. And if you don't believe that, there's a problem. Or if you feel that the therapist, despite what you're trying to say to them, isn't listening, that's also a crucial part. But sometimes it is just about opening that up. It's happened with me with clients where they've said, Sarah, I don't like where you're taking me with this. I'll explain my rationale at that point and say, well, look, sometimes with anxiety, you have to feel a bit worse. Because therapy isn't easy. And I think there's a misconception that therapy is just talking. I have someone who has a phobia at the moment, and I'm asking that person to do things that are difficult. They're doing it. They're really engaging with it. But I can see the anxiety when I ask them to do the things. They're really good now. They're pushing through it because they know that there's a reason and there's going to be results from that. That in order to kind of feel better, they have to feel a little bit worse. But if you don't trust your therapist, that client trusts me enough to go with me on that. And I'm able to explain the rationale. And so they have needed some reassurance along the way in that sense. But because they know me, they know that the trust is there and I listen to their concerns, we're okay in that way. But I think you always know in your gut, don't you, if there's something not quite lining up for you. But more than that, if you can't articulate that to your therapist in some way or form, you don't feel completely comfortable to do that.
In a previous interview, the guest said that she had a barrier between herself and the therapist. And then at some point she thought to herself, what might happen if I actually participated in this therapy fully and stopped putting up so much resistance? And then that was really necessary before she could make any progress, because she was talking about how she had all these limits to what she would talk about, what was allowed. And so I think that foundation of trust and knowing that you and your therapist are both aligned with your progress, with your goal, and identifying what that goal is very helpful.
Absolutely. And I think, establishing that goal is very important as well in the beginning. And as you say, about the barrier as well, that can exist. I think sometimes the greatest learning you have in therapy is through actually the therapy session itself. So like if someone is saying, I struggle with this or with confrontation, and then they're in a situation where they have to talk to their therapist about something, there's exposure happening within the session without maybe being fully aware. If the therapist is doing their job and is helping you and you trust them, you're going to actually start to speak up within a session, which in turn is the reason you're in therapy as well. So it's helping you. It's helping to facilitate that. I always think it's quite interesting when someone comes to me and says, I have no confidence and I can't speak about this. And then there's the turning point where, maybe there's something I say and they go, Sarah, that didn't sit well with me. Or can I just ask you why you asked me that? I kind of say, do you realize what you just did? It's a good learning within the session. And no therapist is perfect. No therapist does things right all the time. I think at the moment as well, therapists are going through the pandemic as well. So, I think not letting people off the hook essentially, but just being aware that we're all human and the best way to move through something is to talk through it. So opening it up, but you have to have that trust with your therapist to do that.
A few minutes ago, you mentioned how therapy is not the same as counseling.
Yeah.
And I think maybe some people might put them as being the same thing, actually. Can you highlight what's the difference between those two?
This came really as a topic when I lived in the UK. So they would have talked about therapy was talking therapy. And talking therapy in the UK was all around the IAPT services, which is very much about CBT-based, numbers-driven, effective therapy. They're looking at, how you're doing, how you get there. And it's about the outcomes, essentially, with clients and how the progress has been. With counselling, it's more comes from a space of giving it time for processing, which is just the complete opposite. So that comes from my background there, just in case I was confusing anyone with that. It is very much, when I talk about therapy in that sense, I'm talking about the IAPT services, which are brilliant in lots of ways. I've learned so much from my time there. Whereas counselling would be, let's take time now, let's process. You don't want to rush someone through a grieving process. You can't be like, come on, next session. Whereas in IAPT, it was very much about that.
Sorry, and what are you saying? IAPT services?
IAPT, IAPT, which are the integrative and counselling and therapeutic talking services. They're not called that anymore. They're the psychological wellbeing services now in the NHS. Okay. They're the services for therapy basically over in the UK.
Okay. In cognitive behavior therapy and in other types of therapies, people learn strategies that they can apply outside of therapy time as well. Absolutely. Now, therapy might happen on a weekly basis. It might be bi-weekly. There are many different time frames in which people can go through therapy. How can people support themselves for progress between sessions?
Yeah. So with CBT in particular, you'll probably be aware of this as well, that, we ask clients to, I'm always cautious not to say the word homework, but I hear myself about to say it. So we give them homework. That's not to put anyone off. I generally will refer to it as activities or practice. We have different words that we use. It's funny, just that word homework comes up and people go, whoa. Essentially what we're doing is we say you have therapy, as you say, either a week or every other week, whatever frequency you have it, but it's only for an hour. So there's only so much that can get done. The learning, the real insight, the real progress gets made outside of sessions. The way to do that is to, I suppose, identify that. We will often get people to either journal, log things, work through different techniques. So sometimes it can be testing a theory. So again, talking about that particular client who has a phobia, they're going off and testing out different experiments over the week. They have to go off and try doing this thing a certain way because their head, their anxiety is giving them all these predictions. Well, I bet when you go to do this, you're gonna, and that person's gonna. So what we do is we write that down. We say, right, that's your prediction. Now go do it. See what happens. So then they have to go. And that's true of a lot of social anxiety as well, because we're so self-focused with social anxiety. We don't sometimes see that maybe other people aren't focusing on us on the way that we are focusing on ourselves. And the only way to really figure that out is to go and do it. Feel the fear and do it anyway, is what I say. But yeah, to maintain that progress, I think writing is the best way personally. Something I do myself between any therapy sessions that I have is I always have a goal going into my session. I'll write down what I want to get out of that session. Be it that, I really want to talk about something that's happened in my week, or maybe I need to work on some relaxation or some self-care, whatever it is. And then I have my session, and then I always finish the session and straight away I write down anything that's in my head just for a few minutes. It could be insights that I've made with the therapist in that session. It could be a question that I've come away going, wait, what was that about? Or it might just be how I'm feeling. That was a really good session, or I'm drained after that session. Some sessions you come away from when you feel a bit uncomfortable about what's gone on, and other sessions you feel really positive, and some you're just like, I need my bed now after that. So I like to keep a little bit of a log of that, and sometimes I go back and there's learning in that for me as well, even aside from anything else, of just the reflective piece. So that's something I encourage all my clients to do as well, for that reason, because I just started doing that. Especially in CBT, you'll generally get something to do between sessions. We always find in therapy, as therapists as well, that tests the level of engagement with the client. So if the client comes and you give them an activity diary after the first session or a questionnaire to fill out, if they filled that out ahead of the second session, you know that they're really engaging with the process. If they come up with an excuse or they are anxious about it, there's learning in that. Like sometimes they'll come and say, I didn't do it, and you kind of explore why, and there's anxiety there. So even there's learning in that. So I think the activities, the coping strategies that we give between sessions allow for progress, because the learning happens out in the real world in your life. You're coming because of things that are happening in your life, not because of what's happening in the therapy session.
So there's not much opportunity to practice truly in the therapy session. It's too controlled.
Yeah, only to a point. I would always say if it's an experiment or something, we would, within means, do it within the therapy session first. Do it in a safe environment, or do a version of it, or test out a bit of the theory, or like role playing. That's a good example. Will be something that we will talk about. We'll say, all right, let's practice this role play. I'll be you be the person, or you be yourself and I'll be the person. Tell me what they'd say. And we get the person to a point where they're comfortable enough with that. I wouldn't send someone out straight away to do something like that, because either they'll be crippled with anxiety and then they'll doubt themselves and lose trust in the process, or they'll go do it and they haven't prepared enough, and then there's a problem.
How can we support people who are in therapy as friends or as family members? And we may or may not know when people around us are in therapy, but what can we look out for, and how can we be good friends and good family members?
Yeah, it's true. I read something recently which was excellent, which was on weaponizing therapy. It's not something that people do too much of, hopefully, but that idea that, you'd say, well, you should have therapy, or I hope you're having therapy for that. It's almost like it's a backhanded insult or a backhanded compliment. It's like you're saying one thing, but you really mean another. And so I think where possible, avoid that. If you see that someone is struggling in your life, they might already be having therapy. And sometimes you do feel worse when you're having therapy before you feel better. So sometimes people actually are in therapy. So say they're going because they're grieving for someone, and all of a sudden they're more emotional. It could be because they've now opened that up, with a therapist. So I think always being sensitive to, we don't fully know what is going on for anyone, even within our own lives. It's a very personal thing, therapy. Some people don't want to ever disclose that they're going to therapy. Other people are very open about it, like I am very open about it. But that's not everyone. There's people who aren't ready to talk about why they're in therapy. You know, it opens up questions. But if you are aware that someone in your life is having therapy or is contemplating it even, I think being as supportive as you can, there's a boundary there. Let the person bring to you what they want and just letting them know that you're there to talk if ever they need it. You know, being supportive, being an ear for them. Because there is a difference between being a friend and being a therapist as well.
So accept that we're not therapists.
Yeah, you're not the therapist, so you don't have to have the answers as well. And not that the therapist will always have all the answers, but sometimes as friends and family, we feel hopeless or that we really want to help the person and all our worry is there. You don't need to be the fixer. You're not there to do that. Be with the person where they are. Just let them know you're there for them, support them, ask them what they need. And if you can help them with that, great, but you may not be able to help. And how do you be okay with that? It is tough.
What do you wish more people knew about therapy?
What do I wish? That's a good question. I think that people knew that it is worthwhile, because I think there's still that stigma there, as much as we like to think that it's not. I think therapy is brilliant. I'm biased, but I thought therapy was brilliant before I became a therapist. It's hard. Like, I think sometimes there's the thing that was going around as well, that therapy is cool. That's nonsense as well. Therapy's hard. It asks a lot of you. People who go to therapy are incredibly brave because they're facing whatever is going on for them. They're looking in that mirror. So I think you get out of therapy what you put into it. Personally, I love therapy. I think it's great. Because it creates that space for you in your week, your month, that's for you, that you don't get otherwise, you know, because no matter how much our family, our friends, our partners, whatever, support us, and they might give themselves to you, they're not impartial. They're going to bring a level of emotion or thought or opinion to it that a therapist doesn't, because they have that distance and they have that clarity that maybe family don't have. Because they love you and they're concerned and all that, a therapist can separate that and say, okay, I see why your family are saying that, but maybe. So I think it's really helpful therapy. Therapy is hard, but good. It's worth it.
A few minutes ago, you also said meet people where they are.
Yeah.
And the topic of the season is self-acceptance. In several interviews, when I ask people, okay, what has helped them with self-acceptance or what has hindered them with self-acceptance, they talk about their community and their environment and how that impacts their sense of self-acceptance.
Yeah.
With your expertise, how can we support each other with self-acceptance?
I think self-acceptance is what we all strive for, really. I think recognizing that everyone's doing their best is one thing. People are trying to find their own level of acceptance with themselves. When I say meeting people where they are, is about acknowledging that as well. It's about identifying where you are and where you want to go, and what can we be doing to support each other in that way, so that we are recognizing that none of us are perfect, but also identifying what we are doing. So what are you doing in your day-to-day? If there's someone in your life who, you know, is struggling with that you can say to them, well, look what you are doing in your day. Something we talk about in therapy is a positive qualities diary, or an activity diary, but it's the things you have done as opposed to the things you haven't done. This is very much a CBT approach, is that when you go back and you have those negative thoughts of, I didn't do anything, I'm not good enough, you now actually have an evidence log, because we're now getting you to focus on what you are doing versus what you're not. You are doing things in your day, but because you have all this doubt and all this negative thoughts and self-talk, it's getting in the way of that. So we're hopefully trying to reshift the focus a little bit there. That's something that we can all be learning from together, individually, in families, in work environments, in communities. It's about recognizing what you are doing. People are, for the most part, doing their best with whatever they have at that time.
Does the topic of self-acceptance come up in therapy?
Yes, it does, quite a lot. Sometimes with perfectionism, or, you know, people who have really high standards. Sometimes it's about accepting, well, how do we get you down from that? Because the higher you try to climb, the further you're going to fall. And in recognizing that sometimes good enough is good enough. That's something that I kind of say a lot in therapy. It's like, maybe good enough is good enough. And you see people going, squirming in their chairs, and you're like, how do we get you to a place that will be okay? When will you be good enough? When will you be the best in the class or the best at this and the best at that? You're never going to get there if you're constantly moving the goalpost. So we need to establish where that'll be. So that'll be something that really does come up in therapy around your beliefs and helping you to recognize what you're already doing, perhaps, and that maybe you're disqualifying stuff that you've already been doing along the way.
If somebody is listening and they have a few minutes right now, what's something that they can do? Do you have an invitation or a challenge of something that they can do in a few minutes, let's say 5 minutes, 10 minutes, that would be helpful for their mental health?
Absolutely. So it's actually a highlight on the Instagram page as well. It's called progressive muscle relaxation. I swear by it. It's where you tense muscles in your body. So you lift your shoulders up towards your ears, hold it for 6, and then roll it out. That releases any tension that you're holding in your shoulders. If you go through the whole body, essentially, it takes 2 minutes max if you do it quickly. You can also stretch that out for an hour. That's what I like about it. And essentially what you're doing is you're communicating with your body that, okay, you're tense. Let's relax you. It sounds very simplistic, but actually when we're stressed, the adrenaline that hits our body is responding to tension. So what we do is we tense and then we relax. We're showing the body, you can relax. So relax, drop your shoulders, take that deep breath. Breathing, it sounds so simple, but when we're stressed, we forget to breathe or we hyperventilate, we shallow breathe. Stop, take a breath, lift your shoulders up towards your ears, drop them, and go about your day. If you do nothing else and do that, that will start to have a physical impact for you.
I found myself wondering the other day, does everybody else also hold tension in their shoulders or in their back, or do other people hold it in different places? Because I remember when I used to go to physiotherapy, after I had a shoulder injury, she kept saying, drop your shoulders, drop your shoulders. And so I guess we do have a tendency to carry tension.
Yeah, we just kind of hunch up. I actually noticed it in one of my shoulders in particular, which is really strange. It's not actually both. I definitely hold it in my shoulders, but when I do that, I really feel it in one shoulder. So it's obviously the way I sit as well. And especially in COVID times, we're sitting a lot more. We're not moving around in the way that we were. But yeah, I find that to be a really effective thing because it's a practical thing that we can do. It's excellent before bed because you're relaxing your whole body and it's been shown to help sleep and the quality of sleep. It's really effective for people who struggle with panic disorder as well. So if you have panic attacks, the first thing that we would say is we need to talk about the physical symptoms and how we're going to reduce those. And I would always implement the progressive muscle relaxation there as well. I have it as a highlight on the Instagram page if you want to work through it. Or if you want to email us, I have a script that I can send you if you want to work through it.
Yeah, that would be great. I'll follow up with you on that and I can include it in the show notes as well. Let's do our fast 5 to end. You have a high power meeting coming up in 12 hours. What are you doing in the time frame before that?
I am going for a walk, making sure I get my sleep. They're the 2 most important things. And preparation is key. I always say, ask yourself what you can do, when you can do it, and how can you go about doing it.
Do you have a phrase or a pep talk, maximum 1 sentence, that you give to yourself for motivation?
Oh, I have so many. That's the problem. Do what you can do.
Where do you live? And if you have guests, what's the first thing you show them or the first place you take them to?
So I live in Dublin. So in the non-COVID times, the first thing I would show people is the beach near where my family live. I grew up near the beach. I was very lucky. And that was my therapy before I ever went to therapy. Even now, sometimes all I need is to plug in my headphones and walk that beach or run that beach.
Yeah, and I never went to the beach in Dublin, but I also got my passport
There's so many
stolen.
stunning beaches in Dublin.
So my last 2 days in Dublin were a bit stressful because I needed to get my passport replaced.
Oh God, yeah. Oh, the stunning beaches in Dublin, if you ever come back again, or in Ireland, not just in Dublin. Yeah.
That's good to know. Yeah. What is the thing that's guaranteed to recharge you and increase your energy?
As much as I don't like to admit it, going for a run. It's the ongoing battle I have with myself. Now, when I say running, like I can barely run a bath. So it's not necessarily that I'm good at running, but it's the thing that I never want to do it. I never enjoyed the psyching myself up, but I always feel good when I've done it. And I have to remind myself of that. So I have to do the CBT on myself and remind myself of the last time you did this, you felt better. So it's a little bit of that self-talk. As much as pains me to admit it. It really does help.
I always think that it would be nice if I could just like bottle up the endorphin rush that I get at the end of a hard workout and just sniff it to tease myself when I don't want to do a workout.
I know. Or these people who just love to work out and really love it. Like I enjoy it when I'm doing it and more so afterwards. But I never seem to remember that ahead of it. Like every day it's a battle with myself, not with walking. I love walking and I walk the dog every day. But as soon as I'm like, oh, I have to go for a run. And part of that, I think, is just habit as well. I'm so used to having that reaction to it. But as soon as I'm out there, I'm delighted with myself. One, for actually having done it, and two, for the endorphin release you get as a result.
And the last one is you've been given the gift of time and you have a free day. You can do whatever you want. What are you doing on that day?
I am cooking. I am going to the beach and I'm just chilling out with the dog and my family.
Lovely. Thank you so much for chatting with me today.
Thank you so much for having me. I really enjoyed that.
I hope you've enjoyed listening to this episode with Sarah. She shares several strategies that you can use for choosing a therapist, for choosing a therapy type, and for helping yourself when you're dealing with situations that may be difficult or stressful.
Be sure to visit Sarah's website, speakeasyvirtualtherapy.com, and her Instagram page, speakeasyvirtualtherapy_. Both links are in the show notes.
If you know someone else who you think will benefit from listening to this episode, please share it with them. You can follow me on Instagram at Changes Big and Small, where I share resources from previous guests and from other people on the topic of helping you build a life that you want. Even as I'm sitting here, I'm noticing that my shoulders are all crunched up. So everybody join me in just taking a moment and relaxing your shoulders. And then if you have a few more minutes and you haven't already done so, follow along with Sarah's script, which you can find in the show notes, to tense and relax every part of your body. It's a great embodiment activity. Remember, change begins with one small step. Have a great week.